Thanks you all for having me, everyone who organized the session and all the logistics of it and so on. And I will say, however, I am an economist, so what were you thinking having an economist as the first speaker? So I'll try to make it entertaining. The premise of the thing is supplies and reserves, and I'll go into that a little bit. But the main point that I want to make is we have plenty. It's a question of, do we have the will and the ability to be able to get the energy that folks are going to need in the U.S. and internationally? And there's some open questions about that. There's issues of resources, cost, policies that we need to pull in effect, and what energy you're going to use and how we're going to use it. Last night, David Lawrence had a good presentation that talked about what the reality of energy was and what do we do about it. And he went through a very, I think, interesting approach of saying these are the pluses and minuses of everything, and so we need to think about that. It's going to be a situation where we're going to need energy. One of the things I will not talk about in this presentation is climate, other than whatever you do on climate, it's got to have the biggest emissions at the lowest cost. There are going to be winners and losers, so don't pick them because the government hasn't been a good job at that. You got to look at the economics of what you do. Reducing emissions is one thing, but if you're just shipping jobs internationally, that's not a particularly good outcome. And whatever you do, it should be reversible, because I hear a lot of arguments about settled science. Science is never settled, and so what if we're wrong? And so that's all I will say about climate. What I have in this presentation is a lot of numbers. I have updated my slides. I'll make them available as long as they're not copyrighted. And so if you see a lot of minute numbers, don't worry about it. I'll get you the copies. And I'll close with the introduction of saying we have the technology. If you remember the $6 million man, well, we have the technology. And part of the reason we have the technology is Mr. Yost's department, where they started out fundamental research on hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and then it became commercial. And that's really a model of what I think we can do going forward in energy. And so with that, before I get into the oil and gas in the 21st century, let's look at oil and gas in the 20th century. Many of you are old enough to remember this. Gas lines, this is in the early 80s, and it was after the OPEC embargo, and everybody blamed gas lines in the embargo. It's nonsense. It was price and allocation controls, bad energy policy. And so people lined up. I also enjoyed this because you remember S&H green stamps? That's how I got Christmas presents in a lot of ways. But we didn't learn anything by the late 70s. This was under Carter, and we still had gas lines. The only thing that they developed as a conscious energy policy on gasoline then was odd or even. So you could buy gas if your plate was odd or even. And so people with two cars that had odd or even plates just switched the plates around and could buy every day. That didn't work. And finally, with President Reagan, they decontrolled oil and things changed with a recognition that markets work, prices matter. And so going forward, that's the way we have. Now, the industry is an old industry. This is from Colonel Drake of August 27th, 1859. Now, that's oil. Does anybody remember where the first commercial gas development was? No? Well, Fredonia. What year? 1825. But at least that's what the record, the American Oil and Gas Historical Association says. But we're an old industry. This is the world's oldest operating oil well, the McClintic #1 well outside of Oil City, Pennsylvania. We took a bunch of energy geeks from Washington, hired a bus, and we went up for the 150th anniversary. A couple of people in there. The guy with a hat in the middle there is Adam Saminsky, who's the administrator of the Energy Information Administration. And then a couple other people. But they run this thing once a year and sell the oil in Drake Well Museum for kind of 2-ounce bottles or 1-ounce bottles, and they sell them for $2. Anybody know how much that is per barrel? Well, there are 5,376 ounces in a barrel, so it's close to $11,000. So they also have another museum up there, quaintly named Pit Hole, which sells it for $5. So that's about $27,000 a barrel. So there's good money in the business if you can do that. But it runs every once in a while, and they sell the oil and so on. Also, there old in terms of pipelines. I mean, we've got Representative Andy from AOPL. The original major oil pipeline in the United States was the Tidewater Oil Line that ran from the Bradford Fields of northwestern Pennsylvania diagonally down to ultimately through Williamsport and into Bayonne. It was a 6-inch cast iron line, screwed together with collars, dug by hand, and finished in 1887. Now, this is near and dear to my heart because I worked on that as a kid. Not in 1887, but nevertheless, it was an engineering marvel. The independents built it to break John D. Rockefeller's hold on transportation, which was rail. Well, guess what? They did that, they ran it for a while, and then ultimately sold out to John D. This is important to me because it was my second job. It was a better job than the first job I had in Pennsylvania, which was working on a sawmill. And other than a sawmill is hard work, dangerous, and doesn't pay much, it's a good job for a youngster. And I like this. My job was basically somewhat of leak detector. It had been converted to a gas line, and I was one of the few people who didn't smoke. So I got to walk most of that line and so on. So energy has been near and dear to my heart. It was a real hell of a job that they had in terms of building it over the Alleghenies and so on. And it was truly an engineering model. It's still there, but the right-of-way is being used for fiber optic. So it's amazing how technology changes. What have we been through? We were just talking earlier about all the cycles we've been through in terms of oil, and it's been a lot. When that McClintic well was first started in 1865, oil was about over $100 a barrel. And then we had a collapse with new technology, and then we've had run-ups and run-downs. And, in those pictures of gas lines in the early 70s, everybody was, just aghast that crude had gone up above $10 a barrel in today's numbers. Well, you can see how it changes. Why does it change that much? Because of what economists like to call elasticities. In other words, how steep are the curves? If you've got a very steep demand curve, a small shift in supply can lead to a big price change. So if you believe that the price elasticity is 0.1, a 1% change in price can be a 10% change. A 1% change in supply can be a 10% change in price. Now, the good news, if you're a producer, is that it goes down fast, but it can also go back up fast. Similarly in terms of demand and supply shifts and so on. But that's one of the challenges we face. It was not, these shifts, due to running out. Now, we've had people talking about running out of things since the 1870s. William Stanley Jevons was the first quantitative economist, and he said we were going to run out of coal. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Then we had the Club of Rome, Meadows and Meadows, limits to growth. We were going to run out of everything. Wrong, wrong, wrong. As long as you've got markets and you've got technology development, you keep finding more and more products. You don't run out. Economists argue you never run out of anything. It can be very expensive, but that's what you need to think about. And I'll go through a whole bunch of quotes of we're running out. You had before Colonel Drake, we're going to run out quickly. Then you had afterwards, we're going to run out in a few years. And over the last 100 years, you got more and more saying, we're going to run out, we're going to run out. And my favorite quote is from Daniel Yergin. This is really the 5th time we've run out of oil. And there'll be another time too, and there's that debate and so on. But if anything, the hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling regulation says it. I got a bunch of slides that say how resource endowment is estimated to increase over the years, and I won't go through that. But basically, we just continue to find more and more oil. We have more and more technology to be able to develop it, and that helps consumers. And if you look at one of the biggest numbers, I mean, this is USGS continually revising their resource estimates and what's there. But one of the biggest is from 2008, where basically, in terms of all types of oil, 20 trillion barrels. 20 trillion. 9 is conventional, and then you've got these other types of oils. So there's a lot of oil out there. Will we develop the technology? Will we have the will to make it? Now, that's oil that's in the ground. It's not oil that we've discovered and so on, and I'm not going to go into the details of going from resources to reserves, but there's an excellent publication, about 200 pages, that if you want to dig through it, you can get all the details of it, what you break down between discovered, undiscovered, what's commercial, what's not. It's a lifetime of research to be able to go through that, but what becomes a reserve versus what is a real technical and economic aspect. But it's been a lot. Here's BP's proved reserve numbers, and you see how they continue to go up. We did reach a point back in the mid-2000s where everybody said, oh, but we've got peak crude. Well, if you look at all reserves, that was only a brief instant. And now we've seen changes, particularly in the U.S., how reserves have dramatically increased. Production has dramatically increased because we continue to find more and more oil, and it's affordable, and it has done a tremendous job in terms of lowering the cost of oil, gasoline, natural gas, everything, saving, households, if not thousands of dollars and so on. We've also got a whole series of other discoveries around the globe. This is for shale, and it's worldwide from the Department of Energy. And this is just shale. Now, there's a lot of other conventional gas out there, Eastern Africa, Israel. Who would have thought that you'd find gas there? But it's real, and it's and those are conventional. More of them are conventional in Australia and so on. So there's a massive amount of oil and gas out there. And if you look at the estimated technically recoverable, you're talking about, for gas, 8,000 trillion cubic feet. If you look at oil, even a technical cover is over 300 billion barrels. So an enormous amount just from shale. And if you look at country by country, the U.S. is one of the top opportunities there. Now, the U.S. has a real advantage in terms of shale deposits for a lot of reasons, the technology, the capital funding, but also because U.S. citizens can own the resources. There's a more powerful incentive to develop it, whereas the rest of the world, that's not true. And so we'll expect to see the U.S. continue forward. This is, I'm sure, a map you've seen over and over again where all the resources are. You've got shale resources of course, in Oklahoma. I'm from the Williamsport area, Marcellus Dead Center. It's marvelous to see what's happened with the economies up there, where now people can keep their farms because they were able to lease their land and get royalties and so on. It's exciting. We've had a little bit of a slowdown, but it's still positive. Williamsport was just home of Little League Baseball. Now it was the 7th fastest growing city in the country. How much is crude oil production? This was the first time I gave this presentation was a few years back, and this is the chart I had. Basically, people were arguing, oh, we've peaked in terms of crude oil, and it's pretty much flat and so on. But if you look forward in terms of what's going on, it continues to grow. The world, and even more in the U.S., and these are the breakouts from the Department of Energy in terms of what their outlooks are. Now, I won't comment on forecasts just yet. One of the things that I could not do working for API was forecast things because of antitrust law. But fortunately, I'll be able to do that at some point in the near future. The question is what's going to happen. This is a relatively recent forecast. It has been a major slowdown. Investment is down. You've had layoffs. And that's something that really does bother me, particularly layoffs, because when we went through the 80s, we had a dramatic downsize of the industry. We lost a lot of people who wouldn't come back. And I hope that doesn't happen again, because clearly labor and capital is very important in terms of the industry. So are we going to need this oil? Some people would say, no, we can instantly transition to something else. Well, here's the Department of Energy's forecast for what types of oil, gas, coal, nuclear, and so on are we going to use. And I want to apologize for the folks last night. You'll see some of my slides are the same as the speakers last night, but I'll just go through them. Basically, we're going to need a lot more energy of all types. Yes, oil will decline perhaps as a share, but it probably is going to increase. And so if you look at the total shares of this is for the U.S., you can see we're going to be around for a long time. And I'll explain why I believe that fervently with the next slide. If there's anything in this handout that you have, take this one, because this really tells you the story of energy policy and how it can change. Basically, down the left-hand side is where we get energy, and down the right is how we use it. And the lines tell you how the flows go. And so a couple very important numbers are this one, 93. 93% of the fuel of transportation is oil. Okay, that's all types of oil. It's jets, it's trucking, it's everything. That's an important number, and it's huge. Now, we do get some kind of fuel for natural gas, and that can expand, and ethanol has a number in it. Likewise, on the other side, over 70% of oil goes to transportation. And in particular, the one that you've got to convince yourself, how is the fuel mix for transportation going to change, is what's the substitute for oil. Now, I know we have potential for electric cars, and I think that's a good opportunity for some. If you're one of 300,000 people who put down $1,000 for a new Tesla, good luck to you. And I hope it's successful, because we're going to need all forms of fuels and so on. But the fact of the matter is, last year we sold about 200,000 electric and plug-in hybrids. We sold 17.6 million. and they're going to be around for a long time. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to need petroleum to be able to meet those needs. And that's both true in the U.S., it's also true in the world. And then all these other things can change, and they can dramatically change. I mean, technologies can change for a lot of reasons. I mean, I never foresaw the hydraulic fracturing horizontal drilling. I think that technology can come up and suddenly be a game changer and so on. I personally think the biggest game changer that we could face in terms of energy is methane hydrates, because you're talking about a vast amount, thousands of years of energy. You have to be able to develop them importantly, you have to be able to do it safely, and so on. But there are a lot of others. I mean, I thought for a while that maybe cellulosic ethanol would be but unfortunately, Department of Energy said it'd be ready in 1980 in 5 years, and they're still saying that. So, there are technologies that can change. There are some that are going to be a challenge and so on. So take this one, and when somebody tells you their plan for the future of energy, make them add it up. These have to add to 100%. That's got to add to 100%, and all of these flows. Otherwise, you're kidding yourself. And then how's it going to happen? And so I don't doubt that it can. There's a lot of opportunities and so on. I'll go through a couple slides. It's the same true for internationally, whether it is for the U.S., because the fundamental reason of demand for transportation is demand for oil is transportation. You think about the world, the Chinas and African countries and so on with very low vehicle per population counts. As they get more and more wealthy, they're going to want vehicles. They're going to want mobility. And right now, it's oil and so on. And so we can have electrics, we can have gas, but you got to ask, how is that going to happen and at what cost? China will likely pass the United States in terms of fuel and gas and oil use, but it's going to grow. It's going to consistently grow forward in terms of the outlook. These are demands, for example, and a lot of it, as I mentioned, is going to be in non-OECD countries, as was talked about last night. And I won't go through the figures, but basically we're going to have a robust growth of demand up to 120 million barrels a day from 95 roughly about now. And I don't see how that's going to change short of, major breakthroughs. And it's because of transportation. You look at transportation and industrial are the big growers over the next few years. We may see households decline, we may see electricity, but transportation and industrial, of which a lot of that is chemicals and so on, are going to continue to grow, and they're going to continue to grow as long as I can see the future. If you look at what roles renewables play, yes, they're growing rapidly, but they're tiny. You look at, part of the biggest share of renewables is hydro, but if you look at solar and wind, you're talking about less than 3%. And even with rapid growth going forward, you don't get to a big number. I mean, it's just a function of shares. And, you can disabuse me of that, but one of the key things to be able to make those technologies grow more is going to be development of storage. Now, we'll see how the Gigafactory out in Nevada works. We'll see how improvement in battery technology, and I think there's an opportunity there. But these are, basically incremental. So, yes, we're going to see increases. We're going to need all the fuels. I like to say I believe in all forms of energy. I worked for oil and gas. My father was a coal miner till one caved in on him. Fortunately, he got out alive and went on to a safer profession on a sawmill. My brother works in nuclear waste, and I burn 3 cords of firewood a year, so I believe in everything. So I think there's opportunities, but we've got to realize it. And, the momentum in terms of going forward with the world and these developing countries and so on is clear that you may see shares change, but there's still a situation where fossil fuels are going to be almost 80% of our energy by 2040. Now, that can change, but that's what the outlook is currently going forward. Now, what could change all of this? Well, of course, it's whether or not we have access to resources. We've got a lot of oil and gas conventional in the U.S., a lot, but a lot of it's off limits. And so if we adopt policies that put things off limits, of course, you're not going to be able to supply those. And the administration has just basically backed off on the offshore in the east a little bit. So we'll see. I mean, it's a long process to go through that in terms of developing 5-year plans and leasing and so on. And that is a policy that can affect the outcome clearly going forward. If you, believe in technology, you'll perhaps believe in this quote. This is from Atlas Shrugged. And so if you know, Ellis Wyatt was the oil guy in Atlas Shrugged, and he basically says, how many years ago was they gave up trying to get oil from shale because it was too expensive? He opines, surveying the Wyatt oil fields, well, wait till you see the process of development. It will be the cheapest oil ever to splash in their faces. And an unlimited supply of it, an unlimited tap that will make the biggest oil pool look like a mud puddle. Give me an uninstructed right away, and I'll show them how to move the earth. 1957. It's amazing. It's happened. So, that's one view of the world. Of course, we have opponents. This is a group that, obviously does not like hydraulic fracturing. I don't know how much they really know about it, but I like to joke that this is like Yogi Berra's quote, 50% are uninformed, 50% are misinformed, and 50% are liars. So, we'll see, but that's what we deal with. Of course, we have eminent scientists who have a view. Unfortunately, Yoko forgot that if you're going to lobby, you got to register. Bad, and so on. We've got the celebrities. This is Mr. McKibben getting arrested and a $100 fine. This is Daryl Hannah, Bobby Kennedy. I find it amazing that folks who fly around in private jets really get upset at emissions. But, that's just me in Washington, and so on. We've got supporters. Unfortunately for these folks, it's in New York State. Sorry, the government made a decision. It's too bad because the southern tier in New York desperately needs it. I'll close with this. This was one of my favorite cartoons. I love you. You're the only one I know who shares my love for hydraulic fracturing. I must confess, my wife of nearly 38 years has never had me say that to her. So with that, I'll stop and thank you very much for your time.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? My name is Jason Ahmed, and most recently I was the former director of the Master of Jurisprudence program at the University of Tulsa Law School. It's just a quick, brief aside. It's an online master's degree in energy law, and its focus is on managing the legal issues. As I mentioned, entirely online, like the one at the business school, so it's convenient and it's challenging and it's enriching. It is, by the way, among the top 10 largest online programs according to the American Bar Association at a law school. And we like to say at the law school, and I say this in introduction for Mr. Taylor, facts and finances are interesting, but arguing about what they mean is the province of lawyers. So if you're not a lawyer already, or if you'd like to be able to pick up the skills to argue more effectively about what the facts and figures mean, think about the law school, think about the MJ program. You can really fit it into what you're doing. Dr. Felmy, I recall the odd and even license plates. You took me back with that picture to a memory of my father in his old International Harvester pickup truck as I was a child sitting in the line and waiting for the gasoline. And the thing that I remember most about that, it's not economic at all, but I remember the conversations. They were a great memory. Thank you for bringing them back for me. My pleasure is today to introduce Steve Taylor. Steve Taylor is going to be talking to us about pricing points, about justifying the new AMP. He's presently the managing director for investment grade energy debt at the Capital Markets Group for Wells Fargo Securities, Charlotte, North Carolina. That's a lot of title. I have a different title for him. He's my cousin. So it's particularly a pleasure for me to be able to introduce him to you. And I can do this from a place of particular, I think, authority. When I say that Steve is the epitome of the phrase that those who can do. Well, I taught. And Steve does. he's bringing us the opportunity to hear about the real life decisions that are presently being made to justify billion-dollar plus investments right now in the energy industry. He oversees the origination and the execution of these public and private bond offerings for energy clients, and I know that because he comes here to Tulsa, and I hear about him flying throughout the West. Sometimes we've seen each other in other cities when we're both working there for different reasons. His work at Wells Fargo has resulted in it ranking consistently at the top of the league tables, and he's been given other priority roles for the bank. Steve's responsibilities were similar previously in Wells Fargo's high-yield debt capitals group, and prior to that, Steve worked for the Chemical Bank of New York and Continental Illinois and Chicago. Steve received his Bachelor's of Administration from Georgetown, Bachelor's in Business Administration from Georgetown University, and an MBA from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. So please welcome me in joining Steve Taylor as he shares with us pricing points justifying new E&P.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor. All right. It's an interesting group to talk to. I don't get to speak to people in academia at all. They won't let me do that. Regulators or associations. I only speak to CFOs and treasurers at oil companies, and I'm responsible for everyone who's investment grade rated, which is pretty much everyone who you've heard of. Many of them here in Tulsa, Houston, Dallas, Calgary, Pemex down in Mexico City. And I'm very fortunate to also have as a client Berkshire Hathaway, who's our biggest investor at the bank, and they're a regular bond issuer. And they've got a unique perspective that they share with me from their Berkshire Hathaway energy business, which used to be called Mid-America. And as I think about all the issues facing the energy industry today, the price of oil, you know, on one hand, and I know everyone is connected to energy in this room in some way, shape, or form, but the low price of oil is a good thing for all of us, right? It's like we save money at the pump. It's like a global financial incentive, really. So low oil is saving the globe a lot of money. At the same time, it's wreaking havoc on the industry itself and the people in the industry. And I'll give you some perspective to that. And even though I don't have anything in my slides about alternative energy, I will say one thing. Alternative energy will take off the moment that it's profitable. Money flows where there's a profit. It's the invisible hand that was described to us by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And we will make the decision to put solar panels or a windmill on our roof of all of our homes the second that's economic to do. And we'll move into different forms of energy and put money into research the moment that's economical to do. But until then, we are more of a conventional play. So I was asked the question, at what price point will energy begin spending again on E&P? And the answer is that they haven't really stopped spending, not by any stretch of the imagination, even though they're all losing money rather significantly. But to answer the question, because I hate it when people beat around the bush, I would estimate it'd be about $50 a barrel for oil and about $2.80 for gas. And I don't get to those numbers with precise science. I could have figured out the break even for each of the companies that I deal with. That would have taken a lot of work, a lot of internal knowledge about their fixed cost and variable costs. But no one's asking me to do a $5 billion bond deal to build something new today, because there's tremendous overcapacity. So If you look at the price of oil and gas, you can see that it's fallen. In 2014, we knew it was at $100 a barrel. It averaged 87. In 15, it was 48. So far this year, oil has averaged 32. If you put any other industry through those numbers, a 70% decline in their revenues, most companies would be already out of business. Think about it. If Walmart had to reduce the price of everything in their store 70%, they'd be out of business. Well, the oil industry is not out of business. Thankfully, it's well managed and well run. But with a 63% reduction in oil from 2014, 49% reduction in natural gas during that same period of time, Wells Fargo is forecasting a recovery of sorts. Now, we know that oil's bumping around $39 this morning. It's up 5%. And we're thinking that by the end of this year, we'll be comfortably over $40 a barrel, so well on our way to what we think is a more substantial and sustainable level. How we got into this mess, it was overinvestment, quite frankly. $75 to $100 barrel expectations. I get the pleasure of asking questions behind closed doors, like what do you run your price deck at? What do you run your models at? What are your internal expectations? And sometimes they tell me. And those numbers were all up around 75 or better. New technology, we've talked about fracking of shale. And then, of course, the Saudis kept pumping. And I'd say for political and strategic reasons, the Saudis were looking to punish the Iranians. They're religiously opposed, Sunnis and Shiites. So we've got that going. What fun. And then the Saudis were also looking to prevent all of the shale that's being undeveloped, that's undeveloped now. That was from Dr. Felmy's map. Think about the shale that's being developed in the United States. It's really only being developed in certain pockets, but it's not being developed worldwide. The Saudis saw that shale gas and shale oil coming, those huge pockets in Russia and all throughout Europe and South America and China. They saw that, so they said, let's pump oil to drive the price down, to not only punish the U.S. Shale producers, but to prevent those future global shale producers from starting up. Absolutely, that's the internal view inside of oil. And then, of course, we've had weak demand. It's been the perfect storm. China's slowed down. The developed economies in Europe and Japan are weak. By the way, Japan is going to be the next Greece. And alternative forms of energy are slightly impacting. But oil production has fallen off of its peak, 9.6 million barrels a day in 2015, down to 8.9 based upon our numbers. And then if you look at the rig count, the energy industry is trying to scale back as quickly as possible. Rig count is down 77% from its peak. And really from its most recent peak in 2014, a number very, very similar to what they were running at in terms of rigs in 2011. Total rig count is a mirror graph that's down 54%. So if you look at some of the data, what does the market think of all this? Well, the market hates it. ExxonMobil, I've got 15 names here, and every single one of these is a client of mine, with the exception of Statoil. And our bank just doesn't have a relationship with them yet. But you can see the market cap of these companies is huge. The enterprise value is the market cap plus debt minus cash. So if you wanted to buy ExxonMobil today, you wouldn't pay the market cap at 347, you'd pay 388. The PE ratio is something that I know people look at, but really in finance, we look at the leverage ratio, enterprise value, EV, that's the total price tag of the company, divided by cash flow. And that's the true valuation multiple that people buy on. And I put that number up here to let you know that at 5 times or less, that's a distressed purchase. They're basically giving away the company at those levels. And you can see Devon, Newfield, Chesapeake are all in that area, even Total and Shell. It's inconceivable. Look at Statoil, 2.2 times. That's unbelievable. Microsoft, in comparison, trades closer to 20 times. So this is a distressed industry, and investors are not getting paid. In the last year, investors lost 19%. In the last 5 years, because of what's happened recently, it's wiped out all the gains of what we had for the last 5 years, and you can see mostly negative numbers in the far right column. And then if you look at select financial data, here we're saying that capital expenditures is down 30%. So the original question, when are they going to start spending again, that I was asked to answer, they're still spending. They've only cut it 30%. The 30% cut is the hope that oil prices will normalize at a higher level. Industry-wide revenues are down 35%. Profits are clearly down. You can see operating losses. The bracketed numbers indicate losses. And they're spending more than their free cash flow by a wide margin. So the industry is very hopeful. Either prices are going to go up or they're going to drive their own costs down. And probably you'll get a combination of both. Oops. This always happens, and I wonder why it happens. This thing is like a hair trigger. And so CapEx year-over-year change, this column to the left of the red box, you can see how each of these companies is cutting their own CapEx year-over-year. And that's a key number. But once again, they're spending a lot more than they can afford to do at this pace. So even though they've cut CapEx, they're really they're spending at a loss. And that's a dangerous situation because it's completely unsustainable, these levels. I mean, the best companies in the industry will hit the wall in a period of a year or two. If you look at the ratios of debt, the second column, total debt to EBITDA, that's total debt to cash flow. These companies are actually fairly lowly levered at this point. So they've got some capacity to take on debt. When they reach a 4 times multiple, that's when they're highly levered. When they reach 6 or 7 times, that's when they're in a very distressed situation. So their balance sheets are okay. But once again, look at the EBITDA minus CapEx. That's the cash flow, the traditional definition for cash flow minus CapEx. They're all spending way more than they are taking in and way more they can afford to do on a long-term basis. Now, the 3 right columns, the 3 right columns where it says return, ROIC means return on invested capital. WACC means weighted average cost of capital. So the return on their business is the return on invested capital. That's how much all the assets of these businesses are throwing off in terms of profit. The weighted average cost of capital is the cost of the balance sheet. It's the cost of debt and equity together. That's what every business manager and executive has to achieve greater than. So for example, Cenovus, their weighted average cost of capital is very high. It's 14%. If you work at Cenovus, you should not be making an investment that doesn't return 14%. Conversely, at Exxon, it's 8.5%. They can make more. They can make lower yielding investments and make them pay off as long as they're greater than 8.5%. Or put another way, they can make mid-teen investments and their profits will be greater than anyone else. And then ultimately, the economic value added spread is the bottom line for all business. I never hear anybody talk about it. It's what we talk about constantly on the desk where I work. And this number is negative for the whole industry. Now, I apologize. Cenovus is not 28% positive. All those numbers on the far right column, on the bottom half, in the far right, those are all negative numbers. I apologize for that. I should have caught that. That was a glitch. But those are all the negative numbers in the industry. And trust me, bond investors who buy these bonds, I did a bond deal last Monday for Occidental Petroleum, $2.75 billion. We sold it in about 3 hours. Bond investors aren't going to be interested in buying bonds from Occidental Petroleum unless these numbers turn around, or anyone else for the in the industry. Okay, so why are they continuing to spend money if they're losing money? And it's economic Darwinism. Basically, they've got to replace their reserves and do it in a timely fashion. Exxon only replaced 60%, 67% of what they pumped. That's the first time in 2 decades that Exxon has not put more reserves on their balance sheet. And much of that has to do with how the reserves are calculated, because when the price of oil drops, the reserves in the ground are worth less. And so they calculate the total reserves based upon this concept of PV10, which is the present value out 10 years. And so if the price of oil drops in half, the percentage of reserves, the amount of reserves drops very materially, reflecting that reduced price in oil, because they recognize that that's oil that will never be taken out unless prices go up. Investors absolutely hate shrinking income statements. They hate shrinking revenues. They hate shrinking profits. They hate shrinking market share. So the elixir for the equity markets is you have to have growth and you have to have profitability. And if you don't have those, if you're shrinking and you're unprofitable, that's a very dangerous death spiral. So these companies will continue to try to grow as they're able to, even in this low price environment. Ultimately, we expect the strong to take over the weak. Pure Darwinism. There will be companies that fail. They'll be failing this summer. The banks are delivering bad news to those who have secured credit facilities. The weaker credits in the oil industry have collateralized their loans with banks with a borrowing base. And the borrowing base gets recalculated every April and every October, twice a year. And the bad news is going out to industry today in April, and their bank loans are going to be cut 20 to 40% on average. That was a number from the Wall Street Journal yesterday. So that's not good. And if they've already got the bank loan fully drawn, and the bank comes to them and says, hey, guess what? Your reserves have gone down, therefore we want you to pay down your bank loan. They can't, because they don't have money sitting around. They're in default. When they're in default, they have to run out and find a partner. And when you're in a desperate situation, that's not the best time to put out the for sale sign, but that's exactly what's going to happen. And they'll keep investing in capital expenditures as long as there are good projects. And there are plenty of good projects out there. Just like Dr. Felmy said, there's a lot of oil, and they'll take advantage of it. And they're actually still doing and looking at the mega projects to capture market share in the future. So ultimately, I look at the oil industry, and I know, like any commodity, it goes through cycles. This is a bad cycle. It's a perfect storm in a lot of ways. But oil companies will keep driving down their cost. So to answer the question, when will they start spending more money? I said $50 a barrel today. If prices don't change, that number is going to continue to come down, because oil companies will continue to manage their expense base down. They'll continue to operate out of the most profitable fields that they've got. And so in the future, when prices go up, there'll be a huge rebound, and I encourage everyone to get into the shares of their favorite oil company at that time. Inevitably, the truths that we like to think about lending to a commodity are high prices lead to overcapacity. We know that when prices are high, we're worried. We're not happy, we're worried. When it was $100 a barrel, every time the phone would ring and I had a client saying, I want to do this, I want to do that, to be honest, we would worry about that, because we knew that those projects were justified at huge oil prices. But the other truth is still accurate, and that is low prices fix low prices. So when you have low prices, it eventually leads to failure and bankruptcy of the high-cost producers. That reduces production and supply. And with reduced supply, it'll eventually fall below demand, and then prices will move up to an equilibrium. So the only caveat to all that basic information is We think that there's a lot of capacity. There have been a lot of wells drilled, and we think they're going to come back on rather quickly when prices start moving up. And so we think we're going to be in a range-bound area between 40 and 50 for some time, because we've already pre-drilled and pre-explored. And then ultimately, if prices don't move up for the high-cost producers, and I've got this done by country, you can see where the pain is going to be greatest. In the UK, that's the North Sea projects that they've got. The Canadian oil sands are up there, the Brazilian offshore projects, all very high cost, but there's the United States with an average price in the 30s. So ultimately, there are a lot of producers of oil that have a lower cost basis and have the ability to put pressure on price during times like this. So with that, thank you.